Hi, it's the Reverend Dr. Nadine Rosechild-Sullivan coming to you with a narrative from my book, Passing the Baton, Birth Control, Precondition of the Liberation of Women. I argue early in this book about how important it is for women to have birth control, to have the ability to control, to plan, to space children, to not have children if we choose not to, that it has enabled women in the first world nations to enter into higher education, to enter into careers of choice simply by being able to control our reproduction. Without it, when you got married and had a baby every year or every other year, then there was no way to do those things. It's also really important. I also argue that it has liberated our men. If we're not having 12 babies, there are 13 babies like my mother. If we're not having 17 children, if we're not having 8 children, then our men are not as financially stressed as well, and we're able to work as well and share our incomes, and which has become highly important in an era of inflation. And so all of that matters to our male partners as well, to the fathers of our children. But also, it is important for males, for people with sperm, to be able to control whether or not they reproduce, when and if they reproduce. And so while the Supreme Court has argued that in the first trimester, it is the woman's right to decide whether or not to carry, if she's pregnant, to gestate and carry to term, and that is entirely absolutely logical, since it is her body that will pay the price. A male has the right not to release sperm into a woman or into the vagina and therefore uterus of someone with whom he's not ready to procreate. So let me just say, as someone who teaches human sexuality at the college level, that it is extremely important to understand that men do have a male controlled form of birth control. It is the much despised condom. In this story, it's called a rubber because that's what it used to be called, but because they used to be rubber or something before they were plastic. But anyway, latex and non-latex plastics. But it is, not only is it a really significant and really effective means of preventing STIs and STI transmission, the condom also, though much despised, is a really highly effective form of birth control by itself alone. It could break, it could come off and get, you need to do certain things. You need to leave a reservoir tip. You need to grip it upon withdrawal so as not to leave it behind or spill it. There are some tricks with it. You need 2 for every act, so that if it begins to unroll inside out and doesn't work right, you can toss that one away, because once it's made a touchdown, it can be contaminated both with STIs and with leaked live sperm within pre-ejaculate fluid. So have 2 for every possibility. They also will get old and crack and dry rot if you keep them in the glove compartment of your car too long, so they need to be replaced with some frequency, rather like the batteries in your smoke detector. But condoms with spermicide are as good or essentially as good statistically at preventing pregnancy as is hormonal birth control. So if I were a guy, I would be using condoms with spermicide. Spermicide is not irritating. Spermicide is not toxic, only to sperm. So anyway, it's available right next to the condoms in your local drugstore. So I am reading a narrative that begins on page 136. And I would be, and even if a woman is on birth control, if you want to prevent STIs, whether you are the woman or the man, whichever body, whatever kind of body you have, whatever your gender identity, if you want to prevent STIs, condom use is highly important, even if you are on birth control. So Michael's girl, page 136. I told him I was on the pill. I didn't so much intentionally lie. I just wanted to keep him close. And a rubber seemed like a distance I didn't want between us. And pregnancy really didn't seem possible. I mean, I tried to be careful and calculate what I knew of my times of the month. At first, I wasn't really ready to be pregnant, but I did want to marry him. and we were in the 12th grade. And if it happened, it happened. But mostly, I just wanted to feel him inside me, him, not a barrier. The threat of pregnancy seemed like an old nun's tale, like all the crap they put out about virgins giving birth and naked baby cherubim and seraphim fluttering around the throne of God, like the pomp and circumstance of little girls with azalea flower crowns and bouquets of tulips marching behind a giant plaster statue of the blue-robed Queen of Heaven. Overblown, exaggerated, unreal. As did his saying that he was gay. It seemed so simple then, in my 17-year-old brain. I was in love with him, his dark, shiny eyes, his deep black curls, that strong but not overstated Italian nose. Even though at 5'9", he was not truly tall enough for me when I wore heels, I figured he wasn't done growing, and I thought for a boy like him, I could give up heels if I had to. And he was funny, sweet and sensitive, but still strong and muscled. Even if not in stature, I could definitely look up to him as a person. And he came from a good family. His father was a hardworking local businessman, and his mother had dedicated her life to raising him and his sisters. She was all I wanted to be, a wife and a mother, the wife of a good man, the mother of stable children. She was nothing like my mother, and his dad was so unlike mine. After our third date, when he took me to meet his extended family, I was immediately struck by the kindness and joviality of their clan. While the wine flowed freely both at dinner and after, no one seemed to drink too much. And they laughed with a tone of understanding when they rehearsed the family story of the time Michael snuck a bottle of his father's homemade wine out to the garage freezer to chill. But his mother stayed up later than usual, so that by the time he brought it in, it exploded as it defrosted all over the family room linoleum, the alcohol cutting a hole through his mother's 10 years of painstakingly laid weekly floor wax, a telltale sign he had no means to cover. Busted. I never experienced that kind of gentleness at home. At home, I hid from the rages, from the father who never knew when to stop hitting the bottle or when to stop hitting my mother or me. I wanted nothing more than for Michael and I to be lost in a world of our own. I fantasized about a desert island, his muscles rippling in the sunlight as he chopped wood to warm our sand cave just off the beach or to roast the game he'd hunted. And I touched myself nightly to the memory of his kisses and of his hand straying inside the confines of my shirt. What did he mean, gay? This hunk of a boy I'd pursued like a steak dinner for the starving, gay? It was preposterous, some sort of pretense. Had some other girl caught his eye? Was this some new and glaring rejection, just another in a lifetime of abandonments? He had to be lying, saying it only to get away. What was wrong with me? How had I driven him away too? There had been Jack in the 9th grade and Tom in the 10th. Had I given it up too soon? I'd never slept with Jack, but Tom had walked away as soon as he'd gotten it. But Michael had stayed, had dated me all year till I thought we were solid. Sobbing, he told me of his feelings for men. He broke down in my arms and I tried to comfort him. It tore me up inside, this holding him while his chest shook with shame, even as his pain twisted the knife in my own gut. He didn't look gay. I mean, he was pretty, sort of extra pretty, but he was strong, even a little gruff. He knew all about sports. He grew up playing catch in the side yard with his dad and baseball with the boys in the neighborhood. He couldn't tell his dad, he sobbed. His father had already lost one son to crib death. He couldn't bear to be the reason he lost another son to shame. He didn't know anyone gay. There was that one family story about the Finook uncle who moved to the West Coast and was never heard from again. One aunt said she saw his name in some credits at the end of a movie once when she, at her psychologist's suggestion, had hired a babysitter to go out on a date night with her husband. But he didn't know anyone gay, and the church said it sent you to hell. And I'll have to admit, the last few times we made love, I started to pray that the nuns were right, that it was easy to get pregnant, and that one of his sperm cells would meet one of my eggs and that insemination would take. And of course, we were still doing it. I was doing it to comfort him as he sobbed. And it was easy to get him there since we'd been there before. He just couldn't be Frocio. He was able to perform with me. By the time I realized that my prayers had been answered, we were no longer boyfriend and girlfriend, and we had quit doing it. By then, I was his closest friend, since I was the only friend who knew that he thought he was gay. In truth, I just thought he was losing his mind, having a psychotic break, or fleeing from me. And by then I had traced new lines, deeper lines into my forearm, with my father's straight razor, thinking about how easy it would be to slip and go deeper. By then I was running to the John every morning, losing the breakfast I hadn't consumed. I didn't tell him at first. I wasn't sure what he'd do. I hoped it meant he would stay. He was talking about escaping just after graduation to Miami. He had some relatives there and he'd heard there were gay bars, maybe even a gay community. I couldn't believe he'd even think about leaving that lovely home as escaping, or that he would consider doing that to his wonderful parents. But by Easter, he was weaving daily tales of an early summer road trip to visit family, a trip from which he'd never return. One night as we met again to talk about his dreams, while his parents and mine thought we were on a date, he noticed my belly was starting to show. His flash of anger was molten and livid. "You told me you were on the pill," he shouted, jumping out of the car and stomping off in the direction of the water tower under which we had parked. When I followed him, I saw his face shatter. He wasn't ready for this, wouldn't ever be ready for this, wasn't straight, wouldn't marry me. I'd never seen him yell before, but even then his upbringing showed. He kept his hands to himself and didn't call me names, which was more than I could say for my father, who had put me out on the street, bruising both face and belly just earlier that evening. Michael took me home to his mom. I didn't tell her he said he was gay, and he didn't tell. She iced my bruises, consoled him the way a mother might console a straight son, with promises of help that would allow him to still pursue his career. She promised the years of help that would allow him to become a man and get a good job and provide for the family he'd begun with me. Hope sang in my chest as she made space for me in his sister's room, who was off to college. And before we turned in, she called my mom to tell her I was all right and suggested they meet for coffee tomorrow. I finished my senior year in their house. Michael's mom and my mom discussed plans for a quiet ceremony. Just the priest and the most intimate circle of relatives, dinner for 10 just after. They booked the church and the local diner for late June. On June 12th, Michael's parents and my mom watched as we, each in our turn, marched across the platform to accept our diplomas. My father didn't attend. To this day, I'm not sure if he stayed home to protest my pregnancy well hidden under my graduation robe, or if my mother quietly uninvited him. I didn't care. In the morning of June 14th, Michael was gone. We found out later when he called from the road he'd taken a long-distance bus. He stayed with the relatives in Miami until almost my due date, then disappeared into the life with a lover he'd met at the bar. Both my mom and Michael's mom were there when I pushed our son into the world. I lived with his mom the baby's whole first year. It was safer than being around my dad. And when I found a job, she offered to babysit every minute I needed. For a good 3 years, she did 40 or more hours a week until I got on my feet and Michael Jr. got into preschool. Michael Sr. never came back to meet him. We got occasional reports. A hospital called his parents once when a lover had broken 4 of his ribs and left him unconscious. And he let them know when a play he'd written got produced at a small Miami theater. I did marry, twice. And thanks in part to his mom's ready guidance, I avoided marrying a man like my dad. Both of my husbands were kind, like Michael's family. Both were good to his son and the 4 more children I had between them. The last time I saw Michael, and the first time his son saw him, he was in his casket. A hospital had called again to say he was ill, and his mother had flown down to visit, then flown back with his body. She managed to get there just before he lost consciousness to AIDS-related pneumocystis pneumonia. He died far enough into the epidemic that hospitals and funeral homes had begun to get past their fears and to again treat the sick and the dying with dignity. So we were able to have a viewing, and the priest pronounced his magic words, and Michael's parents and his son buried him in the hallowed ground of the Catholic cemetery. No questions asked. A portion of my heart went into that ground with him, the portion he'd exiled to Florida all those years before. By then, his son was old enough to be one of his pallbearers, joined by the friends and ex-lovers who had flown in from Florida for the funeral.